The year is 1924. Five miners are huddled inside a small wooden cabin on the eastern slope of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. It is past midnight. The forest outside is alive with sound, but the sounds are wrong. Massive impacts against the cabin walls, boulders striking the roof, something enormous pressing against the door with a force no man could generate alone. One of the miners, Fred Beck, grabs his rifle. He fires through a gap in the wall. The assault does not stop. Something reaches an arm through a hole in the roof. Something else is prying at the logs with raw mechanical strength. The men press their backs against the wall and wait for morning, convinced they will not survive the night. They do survive. They stumble out of the mountains at dawn, pale and shaking, and tell anyone who will listen what happened in that canyon. The newspapers name it the Great Ape Hunt of 1924. The canyon gets a new name, Ape Canyon. And 100 years later, nobody has fully explained what happened to Fred Beck and his crew in those woods. This is the story of Bigfoot. Not the costume joke, not the tabloid creature, not the bumper sticker. The real investigation, the oldest evidence, the most credible witnesses, the science that refuses to close the case, the people who disappeared in areas where Bigfoot is most active and never came home. The fact that this is not just a North American phenomenon, it is a global one. And the question that every serious researcher eventually confronts, if this thing is real, why has no one ever caught it? Welcome to Kitsune Files. Tonight we go all the way in. Chapter 1, Before the Name, 10,000 years of something in the woods. Before there was a word called Bigfoot, before there were newspaper headlines or wildlife cameras or DNA labs, there was something in the forests of North America and beyond that the people living there knew about, not as a legend, not as a warning story for children, as a fact of the landscape. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Salish, the Lumi, the Stisiles, the Halkomelem, have oral traditions describing large, hair-covered bipedal beings living in the deep wilderness for thousands of years. These traditions are not uniform. They do not all describe the same creature in the same way. But across tribes separated by enormous distances, the core description is strikingly similar. A being that walks on two legs, massive, much larger than a man, covered in hair, capable of extreme speed and near silent movement in dense terrain, intelligent in a way that animals are not, and deeply reluctant to be seen. The word Sasquatch comes from the Halkomelem language of the Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia. The Halkomelem word Saskets refers to a wild man of the woods. It is a word that was in use for generations before any European arrived to ask what it meant. But the traditions go far deeper than a single name. Among the Yokut people of California, the creature is called the hairy man. Kathy Strain, Forest Heritage Resource and Tribal Relations Programs Manager for the Stanislaus National Forest, and the author of Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, Bigfoot in Native Culture, has documented hairy man pictographs in the Sierra Nevada foothills, estimated to be between 1,800 and 3,000 years old. 3,000 years old. Think about what that means. While Rome was building its first monuments, people in California were painting what they believed to be the hairy man onto rock faces in places they considered sacred enough to preserve that record forever. These are not recent stories. These are the oldest continuous records of this phenomenon anywhere in the Americas. Among the Yokut, the hairy man is not treated as an animal or a monster. He is a threshold being, a figure that moves between the world of the living and whatever lies on the other side. Kathy Strain documented their belief directly. When you see a Bigfoot, it is not a good sign. It means he is coming to take a soul to the other side. Women sing a hairy man song during funerals for exactly this reason. The Lummi Nation of the Pacific Northwest described the creature as a relative, not an animal cousin, a spiritual relative, one who has chosen to remain outside the circle of human civilization, but who is nonetheless connected to humanity through something older than either species' current form. The Sykes First Nation of British Columbia have one of the most developed Sasquatch traditions of any indigenous group in North America. In their worldview, the Sasquatch are not simply large animals living in the forest. They are beings who exist between the physical and spiritual worlds, capable of becoming invisible at will and of knowing the interior state of any human who approaches them. The Setsailas have practiced Sasquatch ceremonies for generations. Their oral tradition describes encounters with these beings not as random wildlife sightings, but as spiritual events with specific protocols and meanings. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region describe a creature called the Wendigo in some traditions and a separate forest giant in others. The descriptions of the forest giant align closely with Sasquatch. Enormous, bipedal, covered in hair, intelligent, and elusive. Across the continent, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic seaboard, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, indigenous traditions from dozens of culturally distinct peoples describe essentially the same thing. An enormous, intelligent, hair covered biped living in the wilderness, capable of moving without being seen, aware of human presence in ways that seem to exceed ordinary animal senses. The researchers who have studied these traditions most carefully note one consistent finding. The indigenous peoples who carry these traditions do not find the Bigfoot question interesting as a mystery. They find the skepticism of Western science frustrating. To them, the question of whether Bigfoot exists is not a question. It was answered thousands of years ago. What they find genuinely interesting is why the creature has chosen, in recent decades, to reveal itself more often. That is the question they are asking, not whether it exists, why it is showing itself now. Chapter 2: The Year Everything Changed. 1924. Two encounters that should not have happened in the same year. 1924 is the most significant single year in the pre-modern Western documentation of Sasquatch. Two separate documented incidents occurred in different locations involving different groups of people with no connection to each other. Either one of them alone would be notable. Together, they form a cornerstone of the entire case. The first is the Ape Canyon incident, which we opened with tonight, but let us fill in the full picture. The five miners were Fred Beck, Marion Smith, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson. They were working a remote gold claim on the eastern slope of Mount St. Helens in terrain that was by 1920s standards practically inaccessible. The area was steep, densely forested, and rarely visited by anyone. According to Beck's written account, strange things had been happening for several weeks before the main attack. Each evening, the men heard what Beck described as a shrill, peculiar whistling from ridge to ridge, accompanied by thumping sounds like something beating on its chest. They found footprints around the camp, bare footprints measuring up to 19 inches in length, spaced too far apart for any normal man or animal. Then one afternoon, Beck and one of his companions spotted a large dark figure standing near the edge of Ape Canyon. Beck later described it as ape-like, covered in blackish brown hair, standing at least 7 feet tall. He fired 3 shots. The creature toppled over the cliff and fell 400 feet into the gorge below. That night, what was in those woods came back. Around midnight, the cabin was hit by an impact so powerful the entire structure shook. Rocks and boulders struck the walls. The door was pushed from outside with extraordinary force. Something reached an arm through a gap in the roof. Beck fired at the arm. The assault continued until dawn. The men abandoned their camp and never returned. When the story reached the newspapers, the Oregonian covered it. The U.S. Forest Service sent rangers back into the area with Beck. They found the damaged cabin. They found the footprints. They did not find a body in the gorge. They did not find biological evidence of the creatures. Their official conclusion, likely a fabrication, issued within days of the investigation. Beck spent the rest of his life standing by his account. In a book he published in 1967, he added something that most Bigfoot summaries omit entirely. He wrote that he believed the creatures he encountered were not entirely physical beings. He described them as dimensional entities capable of entering and leaving physical reality, connected to the spiritual experiences he had had throughout his life. He did not describe them simply as large apes. He described them as something older and stranger than that. The second 1924 incident involves Albert Ostman. Ostman was a Swedish-born Canadian prospector. He did not come forward with his story until 1957, 33 years after he claimed it happened. His explanation was consistent. He was afraid of ridicule. By 1957, the growing public awareness of Sasquatch gave him a framework to finally come forward. His account was submitted under sworn affidavit to a justice of the peace. Ostman stated that while prospecting near Toba Inlet in British Columbia, he was awakened one night inside his sleeping bag by something picking him up off the ground. He was carried inside the bag across rough terrain for approximately 3 hours. When he was dropped and emerged, he found himself on a plateau surrounded by 4 Sasquatch, an adult male, an adult female, a younger male, and a younger female. He estimated the adult male stood between 7 and 8 feet tall and weighed somewhere between 700 and 800 pounds. The family kept him on the plateau for 6 days. He described their behavior in specific detail. The adult male appeared to have brought him deliberately. The adult female was displeased. The young male was curious and playful. The young female was shy. He observed their diet. They ate primarily vegetation, particularly grass and spruce tips. He observed no tools. He described a social structure that felt organized and purposeful. After 6 days, Ostman escaped by offering the adult male a tin of snuff. The male consumed it, became sick and disoriented, and Ostman ran. Critics note the 33-year delay and the extraordinary nature of the scenario. What supports Ostman's credibility is the internal consistency of his account across decades of retellings, the sworn affidavit format, and the specific behavioral details that align with what other completely independent witnesses have described about Sasquatch temperament and social structure. 2 men, 2 encounters, 1 year, different provinces, no connection between them. The record begins here. Chapter 3, The Man Who Could Not Shoot, William Rowe, 1955. 11 years before the Patterson-Gimlin film, a man named William Rowe had an encounter on Meeka Mountain in British Columbia that serious researchers consider one of the most credible first-hand accounts in the entire record. Rowe was a highway worker, practical, experienced in the wilderness, not given to imagination or fantasy. In October of 1955, he was hiking alone on Mica Mountain near Jasper, Alberta, when he encountered a creature moving through the brush approximately 75 yards away. He watched it for a sustained period in good light, with cover that prevented it from immediately detecting him. His sworn affidavit describes the encounter in precise physical detail. The creature stood approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet across the chest. He estimated its weight at around 300 pounds. It was covered entirely in dark brown hair, silver tipped in places. It walked completely upright on 2 feet. Its arms hung lower than a human's. Its feet were broader and shorter than human feet. Its head was round with a prominent brow ridge, a sloping forehead, and a flat nose. Its teeth, briefly visible, were white and even. And then Rowe recorded what may be the most significant single statement in all of early Sasquatch encounter literature. The creature was female. He could see this clearly. She was eating leaves from the brush as she walked, completely unaware of him. He had a rifle with him. He raised it to shoot, intending to collect a specimen. He could not do it. He wrote in his own words that the longer he looked at her features, the more shooting her would have felt like shooting a person. He said this was not fear. It was not uncertainty about whether she would attack. It was a moral recognition that what he was looking at existed too close to the line between animal and human for him to be comfortable crossing it with a bullet. He put the rifle down. The creature eventually became aware of him. She stopped eating and looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and walked away, glancing back twice over her shoulder before disappearing into the forest. Rowe found what he believed to be her nest nearby, a shallow depression in the ground lined with dry vegetation. He said almost nothing about this encounter for years. When the growing public attention to Sasquatch finally gave him a framework, he came forward with a sworn statement. What makes this account stand out is its complete lack of drama. Nothing attacked him, nothing chased him. He watched a creature go about its business and made a moral choice not to kill it. That specific moral hesitation, that inability to pull the trigger because the creature in the sights looks too human, appears in multiple documented encounter accounts across different decades. It is one of the most consistent and underappreciated threads in the entire witness record. Chapter 4. The Name is Born. Jerry Crew, Bluff Creek, 1958. On August 27, 1958, a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew arrived at his work site in the Six Rivers National Forest in Humboldt County, California, and found something in the mud. Footprints, human in shape but nothing like human in scale, 16 inches long, 7 inches wide. The stride between them was approximately 50 inches. No known human being produces a 50-inch stride walking casually through a construction site. Crew made a plaster cast. He showed his coworkers. They were not surprised. They had been seeing similar tracks for weeks. They had been saying nothing, assuming they were being pranked. Now they started talking, and what they described changed the context entirely. A 450-pound oil drum had been moved from where they left it. A 700-pound tire had been thrown into a ditch. Objects that would require multiple strong men to move had been relocated as though they were nothing. Crew brought his cast to reporter Andrew Genzoli at the Humboldt Times. Genzoli ran the story on October 5, 1958. In that article, for the first time in print, the logging crew's informal nickname for whatever was making those tracks appeared in public: Bigfoot. The wire services picked it up, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. Within days, the name was everywhere. Now the Ray Wallace complication. In 2002, the family of Ray Wallace, a contractor who ran the Bluff Creek logging operation, revealed that after his death, they found carved wooden feet in his basement. They stated Wallace had been faking the tracks as a prank. But here are the problems with that claim. The tracks crew cast show a midtarsal pressure pattern consistent with a flexible foot in motion, not a rigid carved stamp. Physical anthropologist Grover Krantz and later Jeffrey Meldrum of Idaho State University independently concluded that the pressure distribution in the original casts could not be convincingly replicated with rigid wooden tools. Multiple tracks in that series show dermal ridge detail, which carved wood cannot produce. The carved wooden feet presented by the Wallace family do not match the dimensions of the 1958 tracks. What almost certainly happened is that Wallace faked some tracks on the site as a prank on his workers, layering his fakery on top of something that was already genuinely there. The workers were already seeing tracks before Wallace got involved. The oil drum and the tire had been moved. Something real was in that forest. Wallace embellished a real situation. That is not the same as inventing it from nothing. 9 years later, something would happen in the same general region that has not been resolved in the 60 years since. Chapter 5, 60 Seconds That Changed Everything, the Patterson-Gimlin film, October 20th, 1967, Bluff Creek, California, Six Rivers National Forest. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin on horseback are moving along a creek bed in an area with a history of unusual track finds. Patterson has been researching Sasquatch for years and has a 16mm camera with him. Their horses suddenly spooked, and across the creek, walking along the gravel bar toward the tree line, is a large, dark, hair-covered bipedal figure. Patterson's horse threw him. He scrambled up, grabbed the camera, and ran. The figure was female, visible mammary glands. She walked steadily and deliberately away, and at one point turned and looked directly back at the camera over her left shoulder. That image, that backward glance, has been reproduced more times than any other in the history of cryptozoology. The footage runs approximately 59 and a half seconds. Patterson died of cancer in 1972, maintaining throughout his illness that what he filmed was real. Bob Gimlin, still alive as of this recording, has never wavered from his account in over 5 decades. The figure in the film has been called Patty by researchers. She has been analyzed by biomechanics experts, film specialists, primatologists, costume designers, and motion capture technology. Here is what the analysis shows. Biomechanics researcher Dr. D.W. Grieve at the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine examined Patty's gait and concluded that if filmed at the stated frame rate, the gait was inconsistent with any human walking pattern, even at high speed. The stride length, hip movement, knee bend, and arm swing all combine in a way he described as consistent with a very large, non-human primate. Forensic examiner Jeff Glickman spent months on the original film and concluded the figure stood approximately 7 feet 3 inches tall based on comparative landmark analysis. He found no evidence of a costume seam, zipper, or mask. Hollywood costume designers from that era have consistently stated that the suit visible in the Patterson film, with its visible muscle movement beneath the hair, its proportional anatomy, and its breast mass, exceeded the technical capability of costume manufacturing in 1967. The hoax argument has a claimant. Bob Hieronymus said in 2004 that he wore the suit. A costume maker named Philip Morris claimed he sold Patterson a modified gorilla suit. The problems with Hieronymus's account are specific. His body measurements do not match the figure in the film. His walking demonstration, filmed and analyzed, does not reproduce Patty's gait. His story has shifted across multiple public tellings. Bob Gimlin has called Hieronymus's account a lie. The Patterson-Gimlin film has been studied for nearly 60 years. It has not been definitively debunked. It has not been definitively confirmed. It remains exactly where it has always been, demanding an explanation that has not arrived. Chapter 6, The Scientist Who Staked His Career, Jeffrey Meldrum, and What the Tracks Actually Say. In academia, studying Sasquatch is a career risk. Jeffrey Meldrum took that risk and has not flinched. Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. with a doctorate in anatomical sciences from SUNY Stony Brook. He specializes in primate locomotion and foot morphology. He is the most credentialed scientist to have staked a professional position on the track evidence for Sasquatch. His central argument rests on the midtarsal break. In non-human great apes, the foot flexes significantly at the midpoint during walking rather than remaining rigid the way a human foot does. This midtarsal flexibility produces a very specific pattern of pressure distribution in footprints that is extremely difficult to replicate with a rigid fake foot. When you stamp a rigid carved foot into mud, the pressure pattern is uniform and flat. When a foot with a mid-tarsal break moves through mud, it leaves a complex, graduated pressure pattern that changes shape as the foot rolls through the stride. Multiple Sasquatch tracks in Meldrum's collection of over 200 casts show exactly this mid-tarsal pressure pattern. Combined with the dermal ridge evidence, the case becomes more compelling still. Paul Freeman, a former U.S. Forest Service ranger, documented tracks in the Blue Mountains of Washington and Oregon in the 1980s and 90s that showed clear dermal ridge detail. These casts were examined by Jimmy Chilcutt, a fingerprint specialist with the Conroe Police Department in Texas. Chilcutt approached the casts as a skeptic intending to prove them fake. His analysis led him to a different conclusion. The dermal ridge patterns in the casts did not match human fingerprint flow, structure, or depth in any way consistent with a known primate. He stated publicly that whatever made these tracks had a dermal ridge pattern unlike any known species. Chilcutt was not a Bigfoot enthusiast. He was a working crime lab specialist who followed the evidence to a conclusion he had not expected. Meldrum published his analysis in 2006 in Sasquatch: Legend Meets Science. His conclusion was not that Bigfoot is definitely real. His conclusion was that the physical evidence is sufficient to justify serious scientific investigation and that dismissing it without that investigation is not scientifically defensible. The Skookum cast, recovered in 2000 from Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington state, adds another layer. A Bigfoot field researchers organization team set up thermal cameras and left fruit bait near a mud hole. The next morning, they found an impression in the mud of a large animal that had apparently lain on its side to reach the bait. The cast shows the impressions of a heel, a large forearm, and what appears to be a hair-covered thigh and buttock region. Meldrum's analysis, the proportions are 40 to 50% larger than a normal human and do not correspond to any known North American animal. A bear lies down differently. An elk does not have a forearm. The anatomy in the Skookum cast does not fit any known species. That conclusion from a sitting professor of anatomy and anthropology at a state university has never been retracted. Chapter 7, Blood, Hair, and DNA, what the lab actually found. If Bigfoot is a biological creature, it should leave biological material in the environment: hair, skin cells, feces, blood. Over the decades, researchers have collected samples they believe came from unknown biological sources. The most serious scientific treatment of this material came from Bryan Sykes, a professor of human genetics at Oxford University and one of the world's leading experts on ancient DNA analysis. Sykes is the scientist who helped develop methods for extracting DNA from archaeological specimens tens of thousands of years old. His methodology is rigorous. His credentials are unimpeachable. In 2012 and 13, he conducted the Oxford-Lausanne Collateral Hominid Project, soliciting hair samples claimed to come from Bigfoot, Yeti, and similar cryptid entities from submitters worldwide. He received and analyzed 36 samples that submitters could not identify as coming from known animals. Most resolved to known species: bears, raccoons, horses, humans. This is exactly what honest science would expect from a large collection of field collected samples. But two samples from the Himalayas did not match any known living species in the database. They matched with high statistical confidence an ancient polar bear specimen from the Pleistocene era, from a period when the polar bear and brown bear lineages were diverging. Sykes published these findings in a peer-reviewed journal. His cautious conclusion: there may be an unknown bear population in the Himalayas carrying ancient genetic material, and this animal may be responsible for some Yeti sightings. What matters for our investigation is the methodology and the result. A world-class geneticist applied rigorous laboratory science to the cryptid hair question and found genuine anomalies in his data. He did not find nothing. He found something he could not fully explain. The Sierra Sounds recordings are the audio equivalent of the Sykes study. Ron Moorhead and Al Berry, researchers working in the Sierra Nevada of California in the early 1970s, recorded vocalizations in the field that they attributed to Sasquatch. Scott Nelson, a retired U.S. Navy crypto-linguist, analyzed these recordings in detail. His conclusion: the vocalizations show characteristics of structured communication, with formants and tonal patterns consistent with a very large primate larynx and inconsistent with human vocal anatomy. He stated clearly that whatever produced these sounds has a vocal anatomy that is not human. Nelson did not say the recordings prove Bigfoot. He said whatever made them is not human. That distinction matters, and that finding has never been successfully challenged. Chapter 8. The witnesses. Science ignores. Real people, real testimony, no easy answers. Let us go into the encounter accounts that keep this case alive in ways that physical evidence alone cannot. These are named, documented individuals whose accounts have been recorded, whose locations are specific, and whose credibility has been examined. Wes Germer co-hosts Sasquatch Chronicles, the largest Bigfoot encounter testimony platform in the world. His relevance here is not his platform, it is his own encounter, which he describes in detail. While hunting in the Pacific Northwest, Germer had a close-range encounter with a large bipedal figure in the forest. His account focuses on the sensory details that repeat across independent witnesses. The smell, which he describes as overwhelming and unlike anything he had encountered in years of hunting. The sound, a low vocalization that he felt more in his chest than heard with his ears, and the quality of its stillness, which he describes as more unsettling than movement because it was too complete, too deliberate. Those three elements, the sulfur smell, the infrasonic vocalization, and the uncanny stillness, appear with extraordinary consistency across independent witness accounts from people with no connection to each other. A woman named Claudia Ackley became one of the most publicly prominent recent witnesses when she reported a close-range sighting in the San Bernardino National Forest in California in 2017. Ackley was a mother hiking with her two young daughters when she described a large hair-covered figure watching them from a tree. Her daughters also saw the creature. Ackley subsequently filed a court case attempting to compel the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to officially acknowledge Sasquatch as a protected species. The case was dismissed. Her account remains documented public record. In 2020, a corrections officer and experienced outdoorsman named Dax Lone Star, based in Washington State, submitted a report to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization describing an encounter while hunting. He initially assumed the figure he saw in the trees was another hunter. When it stepped into a clearing, his reaction was not excitement or terror. His reaction was paralysis. He stood completely still and watched the figure move away, and he described the specific quality of its face at distance as the thing that affected him most deeply, not because it looked like a monster, because it looked like something between a face he knew how to categorize and a face he did not. He said he had hunted those woods for 20 years. He had never been genuinely afraid in them before that moment. That specific experience, seeing something in the forest and feeling a fear that is not quite fear of an animal and not quite fear of a person, appears across encounter accounts from William Rowe in 1955 to witnesses filing reports in the last 5 years. It is one of the most consistent behavioral signatures of close Sasquatch encounters. Whatever this thing is, it produces a specific and consistent psychological response in human observers that cannot be explained by either the known animal or the deliberate hoax model. Chapter 9, The Missing 411, People Who Vanished in the Wrong Places. Now we arrive at the part of this investigation that most Bigfoot documentaries skip because it is the part that makes the whole thing darker. David Paulides is a former San Jose Police Department detective who spent 20 years in law enforcement before leaving to research Bigfoot and then founding what became the Missing 411 Project. His books document a pattern of unexplained disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas across North America. Paulides is careful about what he claims. He explicitly refuses to name a cause for these disappearances. He has never said on the record that Bigfoot is responsible. What he has said is that the pattern of these disappearances is genuinely unusual and that the National Park Service has consistently failed to maintain, publish, or make accessible any comprehensive record of who goes missing in their parks. That point alone is verifiable and disturbing on its own terms. The United States National Park Service does not keep and publish an accessible master list of missing persons in their parks. Paulides confirmed this through Freedom of Information Act requests. The NPS has a database of incident reports, but it does not interface with other criminal databases and is not comprehensively available to the public. The missing 411 clusters that are most often cited in connection with Bigfoot activity overlap almost exactly with the highest density Bigfoot sighting regions in the country: the Pacific Northwest, the Great Smoky Mountains, the Olympic Peninsula, and the Northern California coastal forests. Paulides has documented 28 geographic clusters of disappearances across North America. Some of these clusters go back to the 1800s. Let us look at 4 specific cases. The first is Dennis Martin, 6 years old, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee, June 14, 1969. Dennis was on a Father's Day camping trip with his father William, his grandfather Clyde, and his older brother Douglas. They had hiked to Spence Field on the Appalachian Trail, a wide, open, grassy highland meadow with clear sightlines in every direction. In the late afternoon, Dennis and a group of children planned a prank. They would sneak up and surprise the adults. The older children emerged from the brush and jumped out laughing. Dennis was not with them. His father realized something was wrong within 3 to 5 minutes. He searched immediately. He found nothing. Clyde Martin then hiked 9 miles to the nearest ranger station. What followed was the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. More than 1,400 people participated, including National Park Service Rangers, U.S. Army Green Berets, Air National Guard personnel, the U.S. Coast Guard, sheriff's offices, Boy Scouts, firefighters, K-9 units, and helicopters. They covered 56 square miles. The search ran through June 29th before being officially wound down. Not a single trace of Dennis Martin was ever found. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a hair, nothing. One detail that appears in accounts of this case has been noted by multiple researchers. A family camping in a nearby area of the park on the same afternoon reported seeing a large, dark, hairy figure carrying something over its shoulder, moving rapidly through the woods. They reported it to a ranger. The ranger apparently dismissed the account. The FBI held the Dennis Martin case file for decades, refusing repeated Freedom of Information Act requests before finally releasing redacted records in 2022. Investigators who reviewed those files noted that the level of federal attention to what was initially classified as a lost child case was unusual. Dennis Martin was never found, not a fragment, not a trace, in 56 square miles of searched wilderness from a location where a 6-year-old disappeared within seconds of being seen. The second case is Jared Adadero, 3 years old, Roosevelt National Forest, Colorado, October 2nd, 1999. Jared was hiking with a group on the Fish Creek Trail near Poudre Canyon. He ran ahead of the group and was never seen alive again. Search efforts covered the area extensively. Dogs were deployed, helicopters searched by air, nothing was found. 3 years later, in 2003, hikers found fragments of Jared's remains on a steep, rocky slope high above the trail area. More than 500 feet above, in terrain a 3-year-old could not physically have climbed. The area had been searched previously. The remains had not been there during the original search. His cause of death was never determined. One item of his clothing was found turned inside out. One of his shoes was in near perfect condition in a location that made no sense given where the rest of his remains were discovered. The third case is Keith Parkins, 2 years old, Ritter Hot Springs region of Oregon, 1952. Parkins wandered from his family's camp and disappeared. He was gone for 19 hours. He was found 12 miles from the campsite, 12 miles. A 2-year-old toddler missing for 19 hours, recovered 12 miles away from where he disappeared. He could not explain what had happened. He was too young to provide any coherent account of the hours he was missing. 12 miles from a 2-year-old in 19 hours is not a number that fits any normal explanation. It is not a number that fits wandering, confusion, or getting lost. It is a number that suggests something carried him. The fourth case is Thelma Pauline Melton, 58 years old, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 1981. Thelma was hiking on a well-maintained trail in the park with 2 companions. She was described as an experienced, fit, and energetic hiker. She got slightly ahead of her companions and went around a bend in the trail. Her companions followed within moments. She was not there. She had not fallen. There was no sign of a fall or a struggle. The trail continued clearly ahead. She was simply not on it. No trace of Thelma Pauline Melton has ever been found, not in 1981, not in the decades since. She vanished on a maintained hiking trail in a well-visited national park in daylight with companions less than a minute behind her. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying about these 4 cases. I am not asserting that Bigfoot took these people. That causal link has not been established. Wilderness environments are genuinely dangerous, and disappearances in them have many causes, including accidents, medical emergencies, and foul play. What I am noting is that these cases cluster geographically with the highest density Bigfoot activity areas, that they share patterns documented by polities across hundreds of cases, rapid total disappearance with no trace found during intensive searches, occasional recovery of remains in locations that defy normal physics of movement, children recovered alive at distances incompatible with their own locomotion, and that some cases, including Dennis Martin, include secondary witness accounts of large, dark figures carrying something near the area of disappearance on the same day. The connection remains unproven. The pattern is real. And the National Park Service's consistent refusal to maintain public records of who goes missing in their parks means the full picture of this pattern is not available to us. That fact alone should be deeply disturbing to anyone who spends time in wilderness areas. Chapter 10: The World Has Always Known. Global encounters and the creature that has no single name. Here is the fact that should end the argument about whether Bigfoot is a cultural invention. You cannot share a cultural invention across continents that had no contact with each other. The phenomenon of an enormous, bipedal, hair-covered, intelligent creature living in the wilderness is documented on every inhabited continent in the world. In the Himalayas, the creature is called the Yeti. The Tibetan and Sherpa people have carried this tradition for centuries, long before any Western mountaineer arrived to sensationalize it. Their descriptions are specific and consistent: a large bipedal creature covered in dark hair, immensely strong, capable of moving across vertical mountain terrain with a speed that seems impossible. In 1951, British mountaineer Eric Shipton photographed what he believed were Yeti footprints at high altitude on the slopes below Everest. The photographs show a clear bipedal track with a proportional toe structure that does not match any known Himalayan animal. Bryan Sykes' DNA analysis found 2 Himalayan hair samples matching ancient polar bear lineage. Whatever is producing Yeti encounters in the Himalayas is leaving biological material that does not match any currently cataloged species. In Australia, the creature is called the Yowie. Aboriginal traditions regarding the Yowie predate European contact by tens of thousands of years. In those traditions, the Yowie comes in at least 2 types: a larger form estimated at 8 to 10 feet tall, and a smaller form around 5 feet. Both are described as hair-covered, bipedal, immensely strong, and capable of aggressive behavior when disturbed. There is no documented contact between Aboriginal Australians and the indigenous peoples of North America at any point in human history. 2 isolated cultures, 2 continents separated by thousands of miles of ocean, both describing the same creature in the same essential terms. In China, the creature is called the Yeren. Chinese historical records referencing the Yeren date to at least 300 BCE, not oral tradition. Written historical records from the Zhou dynasty period. An ancient Chinese text called the Classic of Mountains and Seas, compiled between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, contains detailed descriptions of a large, bipedal, hair-covered creature living in the mountains. Over 2,000 years of documented Chinese references to the same creature in a culture with no historical connection to the North American Sasquatch tradition. In Russia and Central Asia, the creature is called the Almasty or Alma. The Almasty traditions are particularly compelling because they frequently describe beings that appear more human than animal, leading researchers, including Bryan Sykes, to connect them with surviving archaic human populations rather than unknown apes. The Almasty is described as a human-like being, shorter and broader than a man, covered in hair without modern language, living in the mountains and steppes. In Indonesia, specifically on the island of Sumatra, the creature is called the orang pendek, meaning short person. The orang pendek is smaller than most Bigfoot variants, estimated at 4 to 5 feet tall, but enormously strong, with arms described as far more powerful than its height would suggest. In 2001, primatologist and animal behavior researcher Debbie Martyr, who had spent years in Sumatra and had personally glimpsed the orang pendek on multiple occasions, stated publicly that she believed it was real and represented a species of bipedal primate unknown to science. She is not a tabloid source. She is a field scientist with decades of Sumatran wildlife experience. And in the American South, there is the skunk ape. Florida and the Gulf Coast states have a long documented tradition of encounters with a creature matching the Sasquatch description, distinguished by one detail above all others: the smell. Witnesses consistently describe the skunk ape's odor as one of the most immediately overwhelming elements of the encounter, typically a combination of decomposing material, sulfur, and wet animal. A pair of photographs submitted anonymously to the Sarasota, Florida Sheriff's Office in 2000 showed a large hair-covered figure in a wooded area at night. Those photographs have never been conclusively explained. 7 continents, multiple cultures with no historical contact, the same creature. This is not a cultural invention. Something is out there. Chapter 11. Why has no one ever caught it? The question that changes everything. This is the question at the center of everything, the one skeptics use to dismiss the entire case and the one believers struggle most to answer. If Bigfoot is real, why has no one ever caught one? Why has no body ever been found? Why, in an era of camera traps and infrared sensors and GPS tracking and aerial surveillance and trail cameras in hundreds of thousands of locations, has nothing conclusive been produced? Here are the serious answers to this question, all of them, including the ones that are uncomfortable. The first answer is geography and ecology. North America contains the largest remaining temperate wilderness on Earth. The Pacific Northwest alone encompasses millions of acres of old-growth forest and mountainous terrain that receives minimal human visitation year-round. These are not parks with maintained trails and visitor centers. These are roadless wilderness areas where a search team can spend weeks and cover a fraction of the accessible terrain. In this environment, consider what happens to large animal remains. A dead bear in a Pacific Northwest forest is reduced to scattered fragments by scavengers, insects, and soil bacteria within days to weeks. The soil acidity in these forests accelerates bone decomposition. Even human remains in intensive investigations with specifically trained search teams are frequently never fully recovered. There are almost no gorilla fossils. Despite the fact that gorillas are definitively not extinct, the rapid decomposition of remains in their forest environment means the fossil record for gorillas is essentially absent. The argument that we would have found Bigfoot bones by now assumes decomposition rates that simply do not apply to the ecosystems where these encounters are reported. The second answer is population size and distribution. For Bigfoot to exist as a viable species, it needs a breeding population. Estimates of the minimum viable population for a large primate range from several hundred to a few thousand individuals. Spread across the vast geographic range of reported Bigfoot activity, even several thousand individuals is a very thin population in a very large wilderness. Consider that the mountain gorilla population of the Democratic Republic of Congo was for decades thought by Western science to be near extinction, with estimates in the hundreds. The actual count, when comprehensive field surveys were finally conducted, revealed populations that had been hiding from human contact with remarkable effectiveness in terrain far smaller than the Pacific Northwest. The third answer is intelligence and learned behavior. Whatever Sasquatch is, it appears to have learned that humans with cameras and recording equipment are a specific kind of threat. Long-term monitoring studies in the Pacific Northwest have noted a consistent pattern. When recording equipment goes in, activity drops. When it comes out, activity resumes. This adaptive response to technology is not what an instinctual animal exhibits. It is what an intelligent one does. The fourth answer is burial and death ritual. Albert Ostman described a family unit with clear social structure. Social species frequently develop practices around death that prevent the random scattering of remains in open terrain. Indigenous traditions in multiple cultures describe Sasquatch as beings who carry their dead. If Sasquatch retreats to specific remote locations to die, and those locations are chosen in terrain that maximizes decomposition speed, the absence of found remains becomes significantly more explicable. The fifth answer is the interdimensional possibility. Fred Beck said it in 1967, and it has been echoed by enough serious witnesses since that it cannot simply be dismissed as the speculation of a traumatized minor. Some encounter witnesses describe Bigfoot appearing and disappearing in ways that do not correspond to physical movement through terrain. They describe seeing the creature and then simply not seeing it without any gap in observation and without any logical exit route having been used. They describe orbs of light associated with appearance and disappearance events. Some describe a drop in temperature, a sense of pressure, a change in ambient sound at the moment of encounter. These accounts are a subset of the total witness record, not the majority, but they exist across decades and across independent witnesses with no connection to each other. The sixth answer is the one the indigenous traditions have been saying for thousands of years. Maybe we are not supposed to find it. Not because of a cover up, but because whatever the Sasquatch is, it is not participating in being found. It is making choices. It is aware of the search, and it has decided, with the same intelligence that makes witnesses freeze at the moment they would otherwise pull the trigger, that it does not want to be the subject of this investigation. The Estezales First Nation describes Sasquatch as beings who can choose to be invisible at will, not metaphorically. The ability to step outside the perceptual bandwidth of human observation is, in their tradition, simply what these beings can do. What if they are right? William Rowe raised his rifle and could not shoot. Fred Beck fired 3 times into a canyon and never found a body. The Skookum cast showed us what it looks like when one of these beings lies down in the mud and reaches for fruit. It knows we are looking. It has always known. And it has made a choice about how much of itself it is willing to give us. So far, the answer has been not enough. Chapter 12, What the World's Greatest Primatologist Said and Why Nobody Listened. Before we move into the deeper theories, there is a moment in the public record that deserves its own space. September 2002, National Public Radio. The interviewer is speaking with Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall is the most respected great ape researcher who has ever lived, more than 60 years in the field studying chimpanzees. The scientist who changed forever how the world understands primate intelligence and behavior, not a credulous person, not a sensationalist. The interviewer asks her about Sasquatch. Jane Goodall says, "I am sure they exist," without hesitation, without qualification. She adds that she has been receiving accounts from indigenous peoples and from people in remote communities for years. She says the consistency of these accounts across cultures and geographic regions is too significant to dismiss. She says she has spoken to many Native Americans who have all described the same sounds, and 2 who have personally seen the creatures. And then she adds, "I have always wanted them to exist." Jane Goodall, one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century, said she is sure they exist, said the accounts across cultures are too consistent to dismiss. That statement has received almost no lasting coverage. It was noted briefly and moved past. We do not seem to know what to do when someone with that level of credibility says something that plainly, but it is still on the record and it has not been retracted. There is also John Green, who spent 50 years from the late 1950s until his death in 2016 systematically documenting Sasquatch reports across North America. Green was a Canadian journalist and newspaper publisher. He interviewed witnesses personally. He visited locations. He made casts. His books, particularly Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us, published in 1978, remain the most thorough treatment of the historical witness record available. When you look at the geographic distribution of the more than 5,000 reports now in the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization database, the pattern is not random. Reports cluster in the Pacific Northwest, the Northern California coastal ranges, the Appalachian Corridor, the Ozarks, and the Great Lakes region. These are the areas with the largest remaining old growth forest systems in North America. Bigfoot follows the old trees, and the old trees are running out. Chapter 13, still out there, still watching, still choosing not to be found. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are there right now. The old growth stands of Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and British Columbia stretch across millions of acres of terrain that most people will never enter, and that science has never fully surveyed. The wilderness is not smaller than we imagine, it is larger. The indigenous peoples of those forests have known for thousands of years that something enormous and intelligent and ancient shares that landscape with them. They named it in dozens of languages. They incorporated it into the deepest layers of their spiritual life. They painted it on rock faces 3,000 years ago in locations they considered sacred. Fred Beck shot one and spent a night in a cabin being assaulted by its kin, and wrote at the end of his life that these beings are not entirely of this world. William Rowe watched a female eat leaves from a bush, raised his rifle, and put it down because looking at her face made him feel that pulling the trigger would be something worse than killing an animal. Jerry Crew pressed plaster into a track in the mud of a logging road and gave the phenomenon a name that the entire world now knows. Roger Patterson fell from his horse, scrambled up, hit record, and captured less than 60 seconds of footage that 60 years of forensic analysis has not been able to definitively explain. Jeffrey Meldrum looked at pressure ridge patterns in hundreds of plaster casts and concluded the evidence demands serious scientific investigation. Jimmy Chilcutt looked at dermal ridges in casts from the Blue Mountains and concluded they did not match any known species. Bryan Sykes took Himalayan hair to an Oxford laboratory and found ancient DNA that did not resolve to any living animal in the database. Scott Nelson listened to recordings made in the Sierra Nevada and concluded the vocal anatomy of whatever made those sounds is not human. Jane Goodall said she is sure they exist. A 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin went into the woods at Spence Field and was never seen again, despite the largest search in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A 3-year-old named Jared Atadero disappeared from a Colorado hiking trail, and his remains were found 3 years later on a slope 500 feet above the trail in terrain he could not have climbed. A 2-year-old named Keith Parkins was recovered 12 miles from where he disappeared after 19 hours that no one has ever explained. And in Australia and the Himalayas and China and Indonesia and Russia and the American South, people have been describing the same creature in the same essential terms for thousands of years on continents that had no contact with each other. This is not a single cultural invention. You cannot share a myth across isolated civilizations on opposite sides of the planet. You can only share an experience. Whatever is in those forests is real. It is watching the edges of the light. It is aware of us. It is aware of our cameras and our sensors and our organized searches. And it has been making choices for as long as we have been looking about how much of itself to reveal. So far, it has shown us just enough to keep us looking and not enough for us to be certain. The forests are there right now, and something enormous and patient and ancient is standing at the tree line, already aware that you are listening. Chapter 14: What the First Nations Actually Say, the Knowledge We Stopped Listening to. Now, let us go deeper into what the Native American traditions actually say, because mainstream Bigfoot coverage almost always reduces them to a footnote. They deserve far more than that. The traditions of the Pacific Northwest tribes regarding Sasquatch are not monolithic. They are diverse, specific, and in many cases contradictory in ways that are actually informative rather than problematic. Different tribes describe different aspects of the being, and the variation tells us something about the range of what people have actually experienced. The Sisales First Nation of British Columbia, whose traditional territory sits in the Fraser Valley, represent the most developed and publicly articulated Sasquatch tradition of any North American indigenous group. For the Estzales, Sasquatch are not simply large, mysterious animals. They are beings who occupy a specific spiritual status in the landscape, guardians of the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds. They appear to humans as a signal, a message that the person who sees one needs to pay attention to something in their life or community. The Stesiles do not go looking for Sasquatch. They do not regard the search for physical proof as appropriate or meaningful. From their perspective, demanding physical proof of Sasquatch is like demanding physical proof of a spiritual experience. The framework of Western scientific inquiry does not apply to an encounter with something that exists partially outside the physical world. This is not anti-science. It is a different framework, and it has been operating continuously for thousands of years in the geographic area most associated with Sasquatch encounters. Elder August Jim of the Tsetsailles has spoken publicly about these traditions. He has described the protocol for encountering Sasquatch. You do not approach, you do not make direct eye contact for extended periods. You acknowledge the encounter with respect and move on. He has described cases in which individuals who violated these protocols experienced prolonged misfortune, not as supernatural punishment, but as the natural consequence of disrupting a relationship that requires respect to maintain. The Lummi Nation, whose traditional territory spans the northwestern corner of Washington state, described the Sasquatch as a relative, not a relative in the casual sense, a literal spiritual relative connected to the Lummi people through ancestry that predates human memory. Their tradition holds that the Sasquatch chose to leave the circle of human society at some point in the deep past and has lived separately since then, not because of hostility, because of a deliberate choice about what kind of life to lead. The Lummi also carry a specific tradition about Sasquatch and water. In their accounts, Sasquatch are frequently associated with rivers, salmon runs, and other water sources. They are said to protect these resources. A significant proportion of Sasquatch track finds are located near creek beds and riverbanks. The convergence of Lummi tradition and physical track distribution is one of the quiet pieces of corroborating evidence that tends to get overlooked. The Ojibwe, whose traditional territory spans the Great Lakes region, carry traditions of enormous forest beings that share the same essential profile as Sasquatch. Their elders consistently describe these beings as real present entities rather than mythological figures. The Cherokee of the Appalachian Mountains have oral traditions describing large, powerful beings living in the deep mountain forests of their territory, specifically in the Great Smoky Mountains, the same area where Dennis Martin disappeared in 1969 and where Thelma Pauline Melton vanished in 1981. What all of these traditions share across their significant cultural differences is a consistent behavioral protocol: respect, distance, and the acknowledgement that these beings are not simply large animals to be hunted or studied. They are beings with their own relationship to the land and their own response to human behavior. The tradition that emerges from this pan tribal consensus is clear. Bigfoot can tell the difference between a person walking through its territory with respect and a person walking through it with a weapon and an agenda, and it responds accordingly. The Ape Canyon incident of 1924 began when one of the miners fired at a Sasquatch. What followed was a night of sustained assault. William Rowe put down his rifle. The female looked back at him twice over her shoulder and walked away unhurried. The indigenous tradition would not consider these two outcomes surprising. They would consider them expected. Chapter 15, The Population Problem: Why the Math is More Complicated Than Skeptics Admit. The population genetics problem is the one mainstream science returns to most often, and it deserves more than a dismissal. For Bigfoot to exist as a viable breeding species, it needs a population large enough to maintain genetic diversity and avoid inbreeding collapse. For large primates, this is generally estimated at several hundred individuals at minimum, with true viability requiring populations in the low thousands. Several thousand large primates living in North American wilderness should statistically leave more physical evidence than the record shows. They should die in locations that searchers find. They should occasionally be hit by vehicles on rural roads. The counter arguments are compelling but require honesty about their limits. The gorilla example is the strongest. Mountain gorilla populations in the Virunga Ranges of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda have been studied intensively for decades. Despite this, until very recently, the actual population counts were wildly uncertain. In terrain far smaller and far more surveyed than the Pacific Northwest, a known species of great ape maintained effective invisibility from systematic human observation. The Pacific Northwest offers a dramatically larger and less surveyed habitat. The bear analogy is also relevant. There are an estimated 600,000 black bears in North America. How often does the average person see one in the wild? How often are black bear remains found by casual wilderness users? Large animals in dense terrain are far less visible than their numbers suggest. But the strongest argument against the population genetics objection is one that serious researchers least like to state publicly. What if the population is genuinely small, concentrated in specific geographic refugia, and the individuals we encounter are the outliers who happen to overlap with human activity corridors? This would explain why encounters cluster so precisely with specific geographic areas, rather than being randomly distributed across all available wilderness habitat. It would explain why certain valleys and ridge systems produce reports repeatedly across generations, while adjacent terrain of similar quality produces almost none. And if that is true, the question is not why we have not found them. The question is, what are we doing to ensure those strongholds still exist? The old growth of the Pacific Northwest is being logged. The wilderness corridors that allow large animals to move between population centers are being fragmented by roads and development. The rivers that the Lummi say Sasquatch are associated with, the salmon-bearing waterways of the Pacific Northwest, are being dammed and degraded. Whatever is living in those forests is living in a habitat that is getting smaller every decade. And maybe that is why, as some indigenous elders have suggested, the encounters have become more frequent in recent years. Not because the creatures are becoming bolder, because they are running out of places to hide. Chapter 16, The Window Theory, when Bigfoot is the least strange thing at the location. There is a category of theory that has gained significant traction in the research community and that connects the Bigfoot question to a much larger framework of unexplained phenomena, the theory of windows or hotspots. Certain geographic locations on Earth produce anomalous phenomena with a consistency and diversity that exceeds what chance or single category explanations can account for. The Uinta Basin of Utah, where Skinwalker Ranch is located, is the most famous example in the United States. Over decades, this location has produced Bigfoot encounters alongside UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, poltergeist-type activity, unexplained light phenomena, and instances of what witnesses describe as entities of various kinds. John Keel, the paranormal researcher and author of The Mothman Prophecies, spent years documenting what he called window areas, specific geographic locations where the full spectrum of high strangeness phenomena appears with anomalous frequency. He observed that Bigfoot encounters, UFO sightings, and encounters with what he called ultra-terrestrials clustered in the same locations rather than being randomly distributed across the landscape. His theoretical framework held that what we call Bigfoot, what we call UFOs, and what we call apparitions are not separate phenomena with separate explanations. They are different faces of the same thing, a class of non-ordinary reality that manifests differently depending on the perceptual framework and cultural expectation of the observer. In the Pacific Northwest, where the cultural expectation is a giant in the forest, the phenomenon manifests as a giant in the forest. Fred Beck's claim that the Ape Canyon creatures were dimensional beings capable of entering and leaving physical reality fits precisely into this framework. The creatures were real in the sense of being genuinely present and causing physical damage to the cabin, but they were not simply large apes living in the forest the way a black bear lives in the forest. Peter Byrne, one of the most experienced Bigfoot field researchers of the 20th century, who led expeditions into the Himalayas searching for the Yeti, as well as conducting Sasquatch research in the Pacific Northwest, came to a similar conclusion after decades of fieldwork. He stated publicly in his later years that he had become convinced the creature was not simply a biological animal because its behavior was inconsistent with any biological animal he had ever studied, regardless of how intelligent or secretive. He did not have an alternative explanation he was comfortable stating definitively, but his willingness to say the biological model was insufficient, coming from a man who had spent more time searching for these creatures in the field than almost anyone alive, represents a significant piece of testimony. Across the global phenomenon, across the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest, the Yeti of the Himalayas, the Yowie of Australia, the Yeren of China, the Almasty of the Caucasus, the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, one behavioral detail appears with remarkable consistency in the most detailed encounter accounts. The creature looks the witness in the eyes, not the way a deer looks at a car before running, not the scanning, nervous alertness of a prey animal registering a threat, with recognition, with what witnesses repeatedly describe as the specific, uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated by something that understands exactly what it is looking at. Debbie Martyr, who caught glimpses of the Orang Pendek in Sumatra, described this quality William Rowe described the moment the female looked back at him twice as she walked away, not as an animal glancing at a noise, but as something taking a final, deliberate measure of him before choosing to leave. Whatever Bigfoot is, across its many names and its many forms in many countries, it is not simply a large, shy animal that has not yet been caught on camera. It is something that understands the situation in a way that makes every human who encounters it feel, at least for a moment, that they are not the one in charge of what happens next. Something vast and ancient and aware is living in the wild places of this world. We have been looking for it for decades with the wrong tools and the wrong attitude, and it has been watching us look. Chapter 17: What It Does to You. The psychological aftermath nobody talks about. Let us talk about what happens to people who get too close, not in the vanishing sense, though we have covered that. What happens psychologically to people who have a genuine, undeniable, close range encounter with Bigfoot and walk away from it? Because this is a thread in the encounter record that almost no documentary follows all the way through. Witnesses who have had clear, sustained, close range sightings with no ambiguity about what was seen describe a specific psychological aftermath that goes beyond normal fear. The smell stays with them. Multiple witnesses, months or years after their encounter, describe experiencing involuntary recollections of the smell in environments that should not produce it. The olfactory memory of the Sasquatch encounter is described by many witnesses as more persistent and more vivid than any other element of the experience. The eyes stay with them. The moment of looking at the creature and feeling it look back with full recognition and assessment. Witnesses describe this moment recurring in memory with unusual frequency and unusual vividness for years afterward. And a significant subset of witnesses describe a lasting change in their relationship to the wilderness. Not fear of forests, something more complex, an awareness that when they are in wild places, something may be aware of them in return. Not in a paranoid sense, in the sense of knowing that the wilderness is not simply empty terrain. Several witnesses have described this as feeling less alone when alone in nature after their encounter and more aware. Researchers who have studied the psychological aftermath of Bigfoot encounters noted that the reports of post-encounter psychological change did not follow the pattern of trauma or hoax. They followed the pattern of genuine, life-altering perceptual shift, the kind of change in worldview that follows genuinely novel, categorically unexpected experience. Among the Sisales, being visited by Sasquatch is not simply a strange experience, it is a communication. The encounter carries meaning that the person who had it is responsible for interpreting and acting on. Some elders describe the aftermath of a Sasquatch encounter as a period of spiritual inquiry. What is the being telling you? What in your life needs to change? What are you being asked to pay attention to? This framework does not require the Sasquatch to be supernatural. It requires only that the encounter be treated as significant and worthy of careful reflection. What would happen if modern encounter witnesses were given that framework rather than the binary choice between hoax and biology? The indigenous traditions of North America have been asking the deeper question for thousands of years. We are still stuck on the first one. And while we are stuck on it, the forests are getting smaller. The old growth is disappearing. The salmon rivers are being damaged. If we are going to find Bigfoot, we are not going to find it with more cameras and bigger search teams. We are going to find it, if we find it at all, by first finding the humility to admit that what we are looking for may be something our current frameworks are not adequate to understand, and that the people who have always understood it have been telling us so for thousands of years. We just have not been listening. Chapter 18, 6 theories, 1 honest answer, what Bigfoot actually is. There are 6 serious theories about what Bigfoot actually is. Let us lay them out completely side by side so you can see how each one holds up against the full weight of the evidence. Theory 1 is the biological relict hominid. Gigantopithecus blacki is the leading fossil candidate, an enormous ape estimated at 8 to 12 feet tall and up to 1,200 pounds, bipedal or semi-bipedal, with a fossil record in Asia dating to roughly 100,000 years ago. The theory holds that a population crossed the Bering Land Bridge before sea levels rose, established itself in the forested Pacific Northwest, and has persisted into the modern era. What supports it? The physical evidence, the tracks, the dermal ridges, the midtarsal pressure pattern, the skookum cast, the consistent physical description across independent witnesses, the biological plausibility of a large primate surviving in old-growth forest environments. What challenges it? No body, no confirmed biological sample, no fossil record in North America. And the population genetics problem, a viable breeding population of very large primates in a relatively accessible continent, has not left the expected evidence trail. Theory 2 is the unknown North American great ape, a variation of the relict hominid theory that does not require a specific fossil ancestor. It simply observes that new large mammals have been discovered within living memory, that the Pacific Northwest is vastly undersurveyed, and that a highly secretive, nocturnal, deeply intelligent primate could maintain effective invisibility in this environment. What supports it? The witness testimony pattern, the behavioral complexity described across encounter accounts, and the biological plausibility of undiscovered large mammals in underexplored terrain. What challenges it? The same no-body problem, though slightly less severe than the Gigantopithecus version. Theory 3 is the surviving archaic human. Bryan Sykes raised this possibility based partly on his DNA findings and partly on the behavioral complexity and apparent human moral ambiguity that so many witnesses describe. The theory holds that what people are encountering is a surviving population of Denisovans, or a Denisovan-human hybrid lineage, rather than a non-human primate. What supports it? The Denisovans are known to have inhabited a vast geographic range, including Eastern Asia and potentially Pacific coast migration routes into North America. And the witness accounts that describe Sasquatch behavior as falling in the uncertain space between human and animal would be exactly what you would expect from a close human relative. What challenges it? The physical size. What we know of Denisovan physique is based almost entirely on a finger bone, a few teeth, and a jaw fragment. We genuinely do not know how large Denisovans could be. Theory 4 is the interdimensional or paranormal entity, not simply a biological creature that is hard to find, but something that occupies a different relationship to physical reality, something that can choose its visibility and interfaces with the physical world at varying levels of density. What supports it? The reports of Sasquatch vanishing in open terrain, the associated phenomena reported at encounter locations, Fred Beck's testimony, the window area clustering documented by John Keel, the consistent pattern of close-range observers who are convinced they saw something real but cannot subsequently locate any physical trace. What challenges it? It is not falsifiable in any conventional scientific sense, and the majority of encounter witnesses describe something that feels entirely physical: weight, smell, sound, and the movement of something large and material through terrain. Theory 5 is the collective thought form. The idea that 10,000 years of sustained belief and attention directed at these creatures in these specific landscapes has generated something with its own persistence and quasi-physical presence. What supports it? the geographic specificity that mirrors areas of densest indigenous belief and longest human attention, and the way the phenomenon seems to respond to cultural expectation. What challenges it? The physical evidence. You cannot make plaster casts of something that exists only in the collective imagination. Dermal ridges require a real foot. Physical evidence demands physical presence. Theory 6 is the most honest theory. It is what you are left with when you have sat with all the evidence long enough. We do not know what it is. We know it is real in some sense. The evidence is too consistent, too widespread, too cross-cultural, and too physically documented to dismiss. We know it is more complex than a simply undiscovered large animal. Its behavior is too sophisticated. Its avoidance of documentation is too systematic. We know it exists at the boundary of what our current scientific frameworks can accommodate. And we know that the people who have the deepest, oldest, most consistent knowledge of this being have never treated it as a mystery to be solved. They have treated it as a reality to be lived alongside, with respect, with distance, and with the humility to know that not everything in the world is waiting to be understood by us. Chapter 19, what the government did, the laws they passed, and the records they won't release. The government's relationship with the Bigfoot question is stranger than most people realize, and it deserves to be said plainly. Skamania County in Washington State passed an ordinance in 1969 making it a crime to willfully slay, kill, or wound any Sasquatch, Yeti, Bigfoot, or giant hairy ape within county limits. The ordinance described the creature as a potentially endangered species. It carried fines and potential imprisonment. This was not a joke. It was a formal legislative act by an elected county government in the state with the highest density of Sasquatch encounter reports in the country. In 1984, Skamania County updated and strengthened the ordinance, adding further protections and reaffirming the creature's status as an endangered species under county law. Whatcom County, also in Washington State, passed a similar resolution in 1992. An elected county government in the geographic heartland of Sasquatch encounter history passed formal protective legislation and then passed it again 15 years later. That does not prove Bigfoot exists, but it establishes that at the level of government closest to the land where the encounters happen, representatives of the people who actually lived there took the phenomenon seriously enough to draft and pass law around it. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers included a brief entry on Bigfoot as a recognized but unclassified native wildlife species of the Pacific Northwest in a 1975 publication. That entry did not appear in subsequent editions. The U.S. Forest Service has used Bigfoot in public communication and education programs. The creature appears in materials related to wilderness stewardship and the Leave No Trace program. There is a 360-mile hiking trail in Oregon named the Bigfoot Trail, a federal land management agency named a major hiking trail after a creature that mainstream science says does not exist. And then there is the National Park Service and its records. The United States has a publicly funded agency responsible for the safety of millions of visitors annually to national parks and forests. That agency does not keep and publish a comprehensive, accessible record of who goes missing in those parks. Freedom of Information Act requests have repeatedly been used to attempt to access comprehensive missing persons data from the NPS. The responses have been incomplete, delayed, and in some cases denied. There is no good explanation for why a public safety agency would not maintain and publish clear records of safety incidents in the locations it manages. The gap is real, the resistance is real, and the geographic overlap between where people go missing in ways that Paulides describes as anomalous and where Bigfoot encounters are most densely reported is real. The intersection of those three real things is not a conclusion. It is a question, a very uncomfortable question that no one in a position of institutional authority has shown any apparent interest in answering. Chapter 20. The case is still open. Why the evidence cannot be ignored. A final thought for anyone still listening. The record we have built tonight covers thousands of years of human testimony, hundreds of documented encounters, physical evidence examined by credentialed scientists, DNA anomalies found by an Oxford University geneticist, vocal recordings analyzed by a Navy crypto-linguist, 4 specific cases of people who disappeared in Bigfoot encounter zones and were never found or were found in circumstances that defy ordinary explanation, the traditions of at least a dozen indigenous nations on 2 continents, the global presence of the same essential creature from Australia to the Himalayas to the American South, the testimony of Jane Goodall, a formerly passed county law in Washington state protecting the creature as an endangered species, and 60 years of forensic analysis on a 59-second film that has never been conclusively debunked. That is not nothing. That is one of the most substantial bodies of evidence ever assembled for a phenomenon that mainstream science continues to dismiss without serious investigation. The dismissal itself is worth examining. Why is the scientific community so resistant to treating this seriously? The standard answer is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but the evidence on the table is not ordinary. The dermal ridges are not ordinary. The Skookum cast is not ordinary. The cross-cultural consistency across isolated civilizations is not ordinary. The population of credentialed, experienced witnesses from Jane Goodall to Jeffrey Meldrum to Jimmy Chilcutt to Bryan Sykes, who have reached conclusions ranging from plausibility to near certainty, is not ordinary. What is ordinary is the institutional reluctance to be the scientist or institution associated with taking it seriously. Careers are built on credibility. Credibility is built on association with consensus. And consensus right now says no. Consensus has been wrong before. The history of science is partly the history of correct things being rejected by consensus until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The Bigfoot question is not there yet. The evidence is not yet overwhelming in a way that consensus cannot resist, but it is substantial, it is growing, and the people doing the most careful, rigorous work in this field are not getting less convinced. They are getting more. Whatever is in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, whatever crosses the high passes of the Himalayas, whatever the Chilcutt have painted on California rock faces for 3,000 years, whatever stopped William Rowe from pulling his trigger in 1955, it is not going away. It has outlasted every attempt to dismiss it. It has outlasted every hoax scandal. It has outlasted every confident declaration that the case is closed, because the case is not closed. The case is open. The forests are there right now, and something in them is still watching. Patient, enormous, ancient, already aware you were going to look. This has been Kitsune Files. Go carefully in the wilderness. What lives in it was there before you arrived, and it will still be watching long after you are gone.